This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsahone, and today I'm continuing with my limited set review for Streets of New Capenna. So far we've looked at all the multicolored white and blue cards, and today we'll take a look at all the mono black ones. Tomorrow we'll continue with red, and so on. If you want to stay aware of when the new set review videos go up, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Keep in mind with this video, I'm only giving my predictions about how good I think these cards will be in a limited format. That means I'm not talking about any other ways to play Magic, just draft and sealed. That also means we're only talking about cards that appear in draft boosters. I use a letter grade system to sum up my thoughts on each of these cards, so if you're new to the set reviews and aren't sure what the grades mean, you should find an explanation in the description. Also, because I haven't actually played with most of these cards, I'm definitely going to be wrong about some of them. As we start playing the format, I'll give updates on my thoughts in my Needs and Notes series, which comes out every Saturday. Alright, let's look at our first black card in Streets of New Capenna. First up, it's Angel of Suffering, which costs 3 generic and 2 black for a 5/3 Nightmare Angel at Mythic Rare. It's got flying, and if damage would be dealt to you, prevent that damage, and mill twice that many cards. So, this looks pretty good. It has great stats for a 5-mana flyer, and its ability can enable you to drastically alter a race. It can also load your graveyard for value. With this around, you're pretty likely to get things going on the various cards in the format that check for 5 different mana values in your graveyard, and that's some sweet synergy. Now, obviously there is a big downside here. You can get milled out if your opponent can damage you enough, and by the time you play it, doing about 10 damage to you might be enough to take you down. However, what I like is that for the most part, you have control over how long the Angel is in play. If you start to get worried you're going to be milled out, just trade it for something. If you aren't worried about it, well, you can just attack with it and kill your opponent in just a few turns. I don't quite think this is a bomb because the downside is real, but it gets really close to being one, just because it changes the rules of the game while giving you a really efficient creature. And there are definitely going to be situations where this just drastically alters the game in your favor. I just foresee a decent chunk of the time where the situation is also going to get kind of bad for you because of the Angel itself. It's kind of a high risk, high reward kind of card, but I think it's quite good. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Body Launderer, which for 2 generic and 2 black is a 3/3 Ogre Rogue with Death Touch. Whenever another non-token creature you control dies, it connives. That means you loot, and if you discard a non-land card, when you do loot, it gets a +1/+1 counter. And when Body Launderer dies, you return another target non-rogue creature card with equal or lesser power from your graveyard to the battlefield. This looks really good. Obviously, a 4-mana 3/3 with Death Touch can trade for anything, and that's especially nice because it will also usually reanimate something from your graveyard when it dies, even without you trying that hard. That's the base level here, and usually by the time this 4-mana card dies, something will be coming back. The connive upside here is very, very real too, as the bigger it gets, the easier it is to reanimate something crazy. And obviously you can discard the thing you want to reanimate when you do connive. So this is a good card. There's almost no way your opponent can effectively interact with it without getting 2-for-1, and then it can just utterly take over games if it's left unchecked. I think it reaches into the lower bomb range. I'm giving it an A-. Next up, it's Cemetery Tampering, which for 2 generic and a black is a rare enchantment with Hideaway 5. When it enters the battlefield, you look at the top 5 cards of your library, you exile 1 face down, and then put the rest at the bottom in a random order. This says, at the beginning of your upkeep, you may mill 3 cards. Then, if there are 20 or more cards in your graveyard, you may play the exiled card without paying its mana cost. So, you really have to be all in on a graveyard deck to make this worth it, and there are graveyard things going on in this set, so it's not impossible, but you can't just be playing this to eventually get the free spell. It'll take too long for you to get there, and you aren't even guaranteed to hit something that really saves you that much mana either, since you paid 3 in the first place for a card that does nothing but mill you. The good news is that, yeah, there is graveyard stuff going on in this format. And there will be decks that I think can utilize this card effectively. It will be an insane enabler that eventually pays you off for milling yourself. Still, I think this deserves a build-around grade. I think the majority of decks in Limited won't be able to use this and it'll just be an F in them. But I do think there are decks that will happen, especially within Maestros, that can actually use this card effectively. And I think it'll be a B in decks like that. Next up, it's Corrupt Court Official, which for 1 generic and a black is a 1/1 human advisor at common, and when it enters the battlefield, target opponent discards a card. I think people are going to be tempted to compare this to Virus Beetle, but I think the official will feel more like Ravenous Rats than the Virus Beetle did, which is to say, it'll just be alright. The Beetle had the advantage of being an artifact, and in a set with ninjutsu that could rebuy into the battlefield abilities, it was extra good too. So this doesn't have those things going on. There is some stuff going on here that makes this a well-placed card for this format, mostly because you can take a card away from your opponent and then sacrifice it to something with casualty, and you end up with some decent value if that's what you do. Of course, this kind of enter the battlefield trigger can also hit absolutely nothing in the late game, and that's pretty rough, and it obviously doesn't have good stats either, but I think it's a solid playable. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Crooked Custodian, which for 1 generic and a black is a 3/2 Ogre Rogue at common, and it enters the battlefield tapped. So this has above rate stats, but coming into play tapped kind of cancels that out. It isn't like its stats are crazy good in the first place. Still, it seems like a nice 2-drop for aggro decks, and it's one of the more efficient ways to get 3 power in play if you have some cards with casualty 3. It's probably a C. Next up, it's Cut of the Prophets, which for X and 2 black is a rare sorcery with casualty 3. That means as you cast it, you can sacrifice a creature with power equal to the casualty cost, or greater. And when you do, you get a copy of the spell, and in this case, the spell is you draw X cards and you lose X life. So this is really clunky, but copying it will make it feel a lot more efficient. Sacrificing something with 3 or more power is a big cost, though we did just see the Custodian, and tapping a bunch of lands at sorcery speed to draw a bunch of cards and lose a bunch of life could actually be kind of a liability if this set is even remotely fast. Still, paying like 4 for this and drawing 4 cards and losing 4 life is pretty amazing. So, it can be pretty good. The setup isn't easy, but I think this is a good enough card that you probably don't cut it from most black decks, especially if you have good sacrifice fodder. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Cutthroat Contender, which for 1 black is a 1/1 Vampire Warrior at common, and you can pay 1 life to give it +1/+0 until end of turn, activate only once each turn. So, a vanilla 1 mana 2/1 already isn't a great card in most limited formats. It just tends to get outclassed in a hurry. It's really not that much better than a 1 mana 1/1 a lot of the time. And this is kind of like a 1 mana 2/1 with downside, since you have to pay a life for it to be a 2/1. The one sort of corner case use that maybe makes this a little better than I'm thinking is that it's a 1 mana card that you could sacrifice to cards with casualty 2, but I'm still not impressed here. Even for aggro decks, this isn't really a 1-drop that I'm after. I think this is a D. Next up, it's Deal Gone Bad, which for 3 generic and a black is a common instant. It says target creature gets -3/-3 until end of turn, and target player mills 3 cards. So this isn't the most efficient removal spell ever, but it is an instant, and it comes with some extra value with the mill effect. We've already seen, you kind of want to be milling yourself in black in this format, and this does it. You can also use it to mill your opponent, but that's probably ill-advised. Trying to mill your opponent out in limited is rarely a good strategy. You really need special build-arounds to make it make sense. And your opponent's likely to have their own graveyard value, so if you're milling them, you might just be helping them. I think this is, overall, a pretty nice removal spell. Like I said, not the most efficient thing ever, but I do like the additional value of the mill effect. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Demon's Due, which for 3 generic and a black is a common instant. It says scry 2, then draw 2 cards, you lose 2 life. This is a solid draw spell. You get to see up to 4 cards, giving you a good chance to draw what you want, and paying 2 life for that is perfectly reasonable. It isn't really the kind of thing you want to go after early, or that you usually want more than one of. After all, it has no impact at all on the board, but it seems like the first copy is going to make the cut in your black decks most of the time. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Dig Up the Body, which for 2 generic and a black is a common instant with casualty 1, and you mill 2 cards, and then you may return a creature card from your graveyard to your hand. This is kind of a clunky version of this effect. 3 mana to get 1 thing back is not especially good, even with the mill thrown in. Basically, for this to feel like it's worth it, you'll need to be doubling the spell, but the good news is that's pretty easy since it only needs 1 power. It's also nice that it helps set up other graveyard stuff. This is the kind of thing you probably always want one of in your black decks, because getting back 2 creatures late can often seal the deal for you, but you don't really want this showing up in your opening hand. You want it to show up late, and it also doesn't impact the board right away, so you really don't want more than 1 copy, and you usually don't have to value it that highly to get it. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Dusk Mangler, which for 5 generic and 2 black is a 5/4 horror at uncommon, and as an additional cost to cast it, you sacrifice a creature, discard a card, or pay 4 life. And when it enters the battlefield, each opponent sacrifices a creature, discards a card, and loses 4 life. This is a neat design. It reminds me of Damogoth Woe Eater from Strixhaven, and that's pretty good company to keep. The body you get isn't that efficient, of course, but this really delivers a gut punch to the opponent when it comes down. You have to do something a little extra to cast it, but your opponent has to do all of those things when you play it. Note, by the way, that the extra cost is part of casting it. So, if you reanimate it or flicker it, your opponent gets punished by the Enter the Battlefield trigger, and you don't have to pay any extra cost. And those are both things that uncommons and commons in this set can enable. So I think this card is really cool and powerful in general, and I also think it's well positioned in a format that has lots of payoffs for loading up your graveyard and things like that. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Extract the Truth, which for 1 generic and a black is a common sorcery. It says choose one. Target opponent reveals their hand. You may choose a creature, enchantment, or planeswalker card from it. That player discards that card, or target player sacrifices an enchantment. This is a discard spell that actually looks kind of solid. The first mode will often be able to hit something, even in the middle part of the game, and having some enchantment hate in your main deck is a nice thing to have. Now, there will be times where neither mode does anything, and that's rough, but most of the time you'll be able to do something with it, even if it isn't anything that big. Still, you probably don't play it all the time or anything. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Fake Your Own Death, which for 1 generic and a black is a common instant. It says until end of turn, target creature gets +2/+0 and gains. When this creature dies, return it to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control, and you create a treasure token. We get a trick like this pretty much every set now, and most versions of them tend to be pretty solid, and I think this one is too. +2/+0 is a boost that can allow your creature to win a whole lot of combats, and while it stands a good chance of dying too, Fake Your Own Death makes it not really matter since the creature comes back. This gets especially spicy with Enter the Battlefield abilities, and there are also some potential casualty and sacrifice shenanigans this can enable too. I think this is a C. Next up, it's Girder Goons, which for 4 generic and a black is a 4/4 Ogre Warrior at common, and when it dies, you make a 2/2 Black Rogue creature token, and it has Blitz for 3 generic and a black. This is the first time we've seen Blitz in this video, so I'll read the reminder text. It says, if you cast this spell for its Blitz cost, it gains haste, and when this creature dies, draw a card. Sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step. Neither mode here is incredible, but both are pretty nice. A 5-mana 4/4 that leaves behind a 2/2 can definitely generate a 2-for-1, and if you Blitz this, which might actually be the better option, you not only get to draw a card when it dies, you also add a 2/2 to the board permanently. So it kind of gets around the downside of Blitz, which is that you get something on the board only temporarily, and your opponent still has to worry about this 4/4 coming at them with Blitz. I think this seems like a pretty good black common. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Graveyard Shift, which for 4 generic and a black is an uncommon sorcery. It has flash as long as there are 5 or more mana values among cards in your graveyard, and you return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. I'm not normally super into 5-mana reanimation spells unlimited. They're usually somewhere around a D+ or a C-. It's just too hard to actually get a full 5 mana of value out of your graveyard on a consistent basis, and most formats don't have good things to put into your graveyard or good ways to get them there consistently enough. However, this format looks like it might have what this kind of card needs. The Connive mechanic means you can discard things to reanimate pretty easily. So I think this might be one of those formats where this is actually a pretty nice card. And if you're loading your graveyard well in the first place, you may even be able to give this flash, and reanimating some huge thing at instant speed is pretty spicy. It still takes some setup, it still won't always work, but it's going to work more often in this format than it does in most. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Grizzly Sigil, which for 1 black mana is an uncommon sorcery with casualty 1. And it says choose target creature or planeswalker. If it was dealt non-combat damage this turn, it deals 3 damage to it and you gain 3 life. Otherwise, it deals 1 damage to it and you gain 1 life. This has a really cool design for a card with casualty. Basically, without casualty, this can kill an X1 and gain you 1 life, which is narrow and not a great card, but with casualty, it can kill an X4, and that's a crazy deal for 1 mana, especially because you gain 4 life. The casualty does take a little bit of setup, but there are enough nice 1-power things to sacrifice to this that it won't feel like you're paying that much extra for a super efficient removal spell. You may be even sacrificing something that helps you out in the long run. I think this is premium removal. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Illicit Shipment, which for 3 generic and 2 black is an uncommon sorcery with casualty 3, and you search your library for a card, put it into your hand, and then shuffle. This is an interesting take on a tutor. Most tutors, especially those that cost 5 mana, are pretty terrible and limited. It's a sorcery, so you have to play this on your turn and not add to the board at all in most cases, and you're even just breaking even on cards. You're not doing anything really. You do maybe get to search up the best card in your deck, but the cost you're paying for it is often way too much. Basically, you end up breaking even on cards and not doing so well on mana. Now, things do get a little interesting here when you throw Casualty into the mix, because you can pay 5 to draw 2 of the best cards in your deck, and that's certainly better because you're actually netting a card, sort of. Because of Casualty 3, that means you're sacrificing something. And once you get past like Casualty 2, a lot of the things you have to sacrifice are pretty real. So you're still sort of giving up 2 cards to get 2 cards. So you're still breaking even. Still, I think the idea of casualtying with this makes it better than the F it would be without Casualty, but not a lot better. You still don't play this most of the time. I think it's a D. Next up, it's Incriminate, which for 1 generic and a black is a common sorcery. It says choose 2 target creatures controlled by the same player. That player sacrifices one of them. Black often has cards that let the opponent make a decision about something, and they can underperform since there are many situations where your opponent can minimize the damage with the choice they make. However, I think this might make your opponent make a narrow enough decision that it'll be decent. Sure, you'll have situations where your opponent's only things in play are a 1/1 and a bomb, and this is going to feel terrible. And I'm certainly not saying this is premium removal, but I do think there will be enough board states where this kills something you want dead for 2 mana, usually your opponent's second best creature. Definitely don't go into this format thinking this card is Doomblade. Have reasonable expectations, and I think a reasonable expectation for this card is that it's a C. It is kind of nice that if your opponent has like 2 things with shield counters, this is a removal spell that can just deal with a shield counter thing. But yeah, I think this is a C. Next up, it's Join the Maestros, which for 4 generic and a black is a common sorcery with Casualty 2, and it creates a 4/3 Black Ogre Warrior creature token. So this seems like a solid common. Without Casualty, it wouldn't be very good, but if you have some decent fodder to sacrifice, you pay 5 and get 2 4/3s, sort of upgrading whatever it is you sacrificed and then getting a whole other body, and I think that seems solid. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Maestros Initiate, which for 2 generic and a black is a 3/1 human citizen at common, and you can pay 4 generic and a blue-red hybrid mana to exile it from your graveyard and draw 2 cards and discard a card. This doesn't have good stats, but trading with it and then using its ability later in the game from the graveyard seems nice. It also works well with both Connive and Casualty because it'll end up in the graveyard while giving you some value. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Midnight Assassin, which for 2 generic and a black is a 1/2 vampire assassin at common, and it has flying and death touch. As usual, a death toucher can trade with anything, and this is one that can even block flyers, so that's nice. And if it can't trade with something or you don't want to trade it for something, it can also attack reasonably well in the air. I think this is a C. Next up, it's Murder, which for 1 generic and 2 black is a common instant, and it says destroy target creature. So, as usual, when you see this card, it's premium removal. Even with shield counters around, paying 3 mana for this to destroy most things that don't have shield counters is pretty great. Another downside about it is that it isn't easily splashable, but it's still worth a pretty high pick, and it's probably still black's best common. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Night Clubber, which for 1 generic and 2 black is a 2/2 human warrior at uncommon. When it enters the battlefield, creatures your opponents control get -1/-1 until end of turn, and it has Blitz for 2 generic and a black. This is good. It's a lot like Plague Mare, and that card played pretty well. Giving -1/-1 to only your opponent's creatures often opens the door to a much more effective attack for you, and it will just outright kill a creature or 2 pretty often. Having Blitz in the mix is nice. Because you'll feel like you're getting a card worth of value out of this a lot anyway, so getting the effect going, being able to attack with a clubber right away, and then also getting a card back is going to feel pretty nice. I feel pretty good about this card. I think it's a B. Next up, it's Raphine Silencer, which for 2 generic and a black is a 1/1 human assassin at uncommon. When it enters the battlefield, it connives, and when it dies, target creature an opponent controls gets -X/-X until end of turn, where X is Raphine Silencer's power. So this can often be a 3 mana 2/2 that gives -2/-2 to something when it dies that also helped you loot, and that's definitely a nice 2 for 1. This also means it's great to sacrifice to things with Casualty. Even if it's only a 1/1 that loots once, you're getting a decent deal. It gets a lot better if you have other ways to pump it, of course, but even on its own, you end up with a pretty nice card. I think this is a C+. Next up, it's Revel Ruiner, which for 3 generic and a red is a 3/1 Cephalid Rogue at common. It's got Menace, and when it enters the battlefield, it connives. So, a 4 mana 4/2 with Menace that loots, although you had to discard a real card to give it that power, is pretty nice. The alternative of this helping you throw away an unwanted land for a fresh non-land card and giving you a 3/1 Menace is okay too. I think this is a C. Next up, it's Rogue's Gallery, which for 2 generic and a black is an uncommon sorcery, and it says for each color, return up to 1 target creature card of that color from your graveyard to your hand. So this format's going to have a lot of 3-color decks, and I think that means most black decks will be able to pretty easily get back 2 cards with this, and getting back 3 isn't out of the question, especially because black seems so good at loading the graveyard in this set. Like other cards that get creatures back in your hand from your graveyard, you definitely don't want a bunch of these. Having 1 card like this is pretty good. If you cast this late and it gets you back 2 things, it's going to be pretty hard for you to lose, and if you get back 3, you probably don't lose at all. You don't want to value it too highly because you really only want 1 copy, and it's still pretty situational, but I think it's a C+. Next up, it's Sanguine Spy, which for 2 generic and a black is a 2/3 vampire rogue at rare. It's got Menace and Lifelink, and you can pay 1 and sack another creature and look at the top card of your library, and you may put that card into your graveyard. At the beginning of your end step, if there are 5 or more mana values among cards in your graveyard, you may pay 2 life, and if you do, draw a card. So a 3-mana 2/3 with Menace and Lifelink is already like a C+, and you're getting a lot more than that for your investment here. Sure, paying 1 and sacking a creature to surveil 1 isn't great, but combined with the other effect this card has, it's pretty good. Because once your graveyard is loaded enough, you can just start drawing cards with Sanguine Spy at your end step. And obviously, the pay 1 and sack and surveil effect is going to help you do that in the first place. Still, getting those 5 mana values into your graveyard like in a hurry, like by turn 3 when you play this, isn't going to be the easiest thing in the world, but this does seem like it's going to generate some pretty impressive value in the mid to late game. I think it's a B. Next up, it's Shadow of Mortality, which for 13 and 2 black mana is a 7/7 avatar at rare, and if your life total is less than your starting life total, it costs X less to cast, where X is the difference. So they gave Modern and Legacy Shadow decks a new tool. This isn't very good in Limited, though. You won't be able to cast this until your life total gets to about 10, and at that point what you're getting is a 5-mana 7/7 that's a vanilla creature, and yeah, that's pretty good, but that also means it's going to be stuck in your hand for much of the game anytime your life is like more than 10. And sure, it also means on the flip side, if your life is really low, you can play this 7/7 really cheaply. But by the time your life is that low, you're probably either so close to being dead that playing a vanilla 7/7 doesn't really matter, or the game is so late that you have a bunch of mana anyway. So yeah, I don't think this is especially playable in Limited. It's going to be stuck in your hand way too often to be worth it, and it's not like the payoff is anything that exciting most of the time anyway. I'm going to give it a D-. Next time, it's Shakedown Heavy, which for 2 generic and a black is a 6/4 Ogre Warrior at rare with Menace, and when it attacks, the defending player may have you draw a card. If they do, untap Shakedown Heavy and remove it from combat. So this is pretty good. This is another black card that has your opponent make a decision that I actually like in this format, and I actually like this one quite a bit. Sure, your opponent's going to make a decision about this card that puts them in the best position possible, but it's not like either option is great for them. So either they have to deal with the fact that you have a 6/4 with Menace as early as turn 3, and that's not an easy thing to stop, or they have to let you draw a card and untap the Shakedown Heavy. And that's what really sells me on this card, is that even if you're in a situation where you're like, attacking with this doesn't really benefit me very much, you can still keep it back, and it's a pretty sizable blocker. And if your opponent does let you draw the card, sure, they're not taking 6 damage, but they do make it so Shakedown Heavy is relevant on your side of the board during their turn. So, this card isn't a bomb or anything, but it's incredibly efficient, and it's going to generate a lot of value basically no matter what your opponent does about it. There will be times where they can just be like, sure, I'm going to take 6 a couple times and kill you, so it doesn't matter. But there's no one in the world who sees this come down on turn 3 and just sort of shrugs like they're not concerned about it. Like, it's going to cause a problem, whether it's generating card advantage or doing a bunch of damage for you. So yeah, it's a pretty good card. I think it's a B in the end, and I think if I'm wrong about this one, it's going to be even better. Next up, it's Tavern Swindler, which for 1 generic and a black is a 2/2 human rogue at uncommon, and you can tap it and pay 3 life and flip a coin, and if you win the flip, you gain 6 life. This is a reprint and not an especially good one. Last time we saw it, there was actually a life gain theme, a big one, but that's not really the case here. We'll see that there's a little bit of a life gain thing going on, but it's not an archetype or anything like that. It's just sort of a tiny sub-theme. And a format where there is life gain is really the only kind of place where a card like this makes sense, because over the long haul, you end up basically breaking even on life. But anything that gains you life and you have life gain payoffs is worth it, but there just aren't enough of them in this format, so it's mostly a bear with really low upside. And I think that means it's a C-. Next up, it's Tenacious Underdog, which for 1 generic and a black is a 3/2 human warrior at rare. It has Blitz for 2 generic and 2 black, and you pay 2 life. And you can cast it from your graveyard using its Blitz ability. This is really good. Obviously, it has above rate stats to begin with, but then, after it trades with something or whatever, it can also Blitz out of the graveyard all game long. And sure, paying 4 and 2 life for a 3/2 with haste isn't amazing, but keep in mind it also draws you a card every time it comes back too. And it's upside on a card that has probably already done something in the game. This does cause problems for your opponent as the game goes on if it just keeps coming back. They have to account for this creature every turn, or you might make things even worse for them. And even if they do account for it, it's still basically drawing you a card and giving you a free attack every turn. And this format has plenty of graveyard and sacrifice synergy. I think this is a B+. Next up, it's Vampire Scrivener, which for 4 generic and a black is a 2/2 Vampire Warlock and uncommon. It's got flying. And whenever you gain life during your turn, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. And whenever you lose life during your turn, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. So this has the potential to get massive, but it has some pretty awful starting stats that will allow your opponent to pay 1 or 2 mana to kill this 5-drop. And that's rough. What's more is, losing life on your turn isn't super easy. So you're mostly going to be leaning on the life gain angle, which will happen, but as I've said, it also isn't a major theme in the format. It is kind of funny that you can get 2 uncommons like this and Tavern Swindler combined would make for a pretty crazy combo, but they're so mediocre on their own that I'm not that impressed. I think this is better than Tavern Swindler, but not by a lot. I think it's a C. And our last black card is Whack, which for 3 generic and a black is an uncommon sorcery, and it costs 3 less to cast if it targets a white creature, and target creature gets -4/-4 until end of turn. So without a white target, this is probably like a C+. A sorcery for 4 that gives -4/-4 just isn't a great rate. It's definitely fine. You know, it will trade 1 for 1 with something, and it can kill things that cost about 4 mana or maybe a little bit more. But that's sort of the base level of the card. It has the amazing upside of costing only 1 black mana when it targets something white, and like I've been saying with all these color hosing cards, in a format where most people are playing 3 colors, you're going to find yourself up against an opponent playing the color that this hoses more often than you'd think. So, I mean, yeah, if this was 1 black to give -4/-4 to something at sorcery speed, it would probably be a B+. The base level of the card, like I said, is a C+. I think I'm willing to go all the way up to a B- as the grade for this card overall. Well, those are all my thoughts on the black cards in Streets of New Capenna. Tomorrow, I'll be back to talk about all the red cards. If you want to stay aware of when that video goes up, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on the rest of this review, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. And if you want to go the extra mile in supporting the channel, you can on Patreon. Thanks for watching.